A roof terrace. A primary school with a paddling pool. A movie screen made of concrete. A sports hall. Inside, corridors that stretch 150 meters, 337 apartments for 1,600 residents under one roof. Supermarket, bakery, hairdresser, butcher, library, all built on a human scale. Cité radieuse, the radiant city on the outskirts of Marseille, a vision of the residential building of the future. A building like a small city, conceived and built last century by architect Le Corbusier. On the other side of the world, the barrio Pikachu in Colombia's Medellín. Here, 250,000 people are crammed into the smallest of space. A neighborhood built and expanded by its residents. The north and the south, the yesterday and the today. The 20th century was rich in visions of utopia and better societies. The question was how to build a new world, and who could build it. A small art college in the German provinces played a key role in all that. Its vision stretches right up to the present day. When you think of Bauhaus, you think of modern architecture, beautiful design, and colorful figures. But it was first and foremost a school, a campus home for utopians, inventors, and dreamers. In the 1930s, Bauhaus protagonist Exanti Shavinsky posed a question of whether the aim was to design the environment or redesign the world. Good question, then and now. In the 1990s, Stephen Kovacs developed media art projects and exhibitions at Bauhaus Dessau.
When I first came in 1989, just a few days after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I wasn't even sure back then, as an architecture student in Canada, if the Bauhaus as a building in East Germany still existed, whether it was still there, or a ruin, or fenced in, but I had to find it. For me, the Bauhaus was one of the most important icons of the 20th century. As I arrived in Dessau and came closer, wow, yes, this Bauhaus actually did exist. Amazing.
Das ist ein Hammer.
Today we see that the Bauhaus buildings are still here, while the furniture and design objects are mostly stored away in museums and warehouses. But for us, we never wanted to see the Bauhaus reduced to simply being a museum, but to persevere as a piece of living architecture with functions that have sense today. However, the whole story of the Bauhaus didn't begin in Dessau at all, but in Weimar.
Weimar. Goethe. Schiller. No place is more evocative of the German classics, conservative and ultra-provincial. It was here that Berlin architect Walter Gropius founded the Staatliches Bauhaus, known to us simply as Bauhaus, in 1919. So it was here, of all places, that people flocked with dreams of building the cathedrals of the future, of crystal cloud cuckoo lands, of new beginnings after the disaster that was World War I, of new people who could overcome anything, the disaffections of work, the division of soul and body, the wretched circumstances of life. If you want vision, you need visionaries. Building the future required new master builders, but they could not be trained by the legacy architects.
Walter Gropius hat 1919 eine ganze Reihe von Künstlern als Bauhausmeister berufen, unter anderem Wassily Kandinsky, Lionel Feininger, Paul Klee und Johannes Itten. Johannes Itten war für das Bauhaus oder wurde für das Bauhaus besonders wichtig, weil er schon ein erfahrener Pädagoge war und kannte sich demzufolge bestens mit dem Unterrichten aus und führte dann auch den Vorkurs, also den erstsemestrigen Vorbereitungskurs für alle Studierenden ein. Ein Semester oder später dann auch 2 Semester lang beschäftigt, wenn man sich unter der Leitung von Itten zunächst mit diesen Materialstudien. Es ging darum, dass die Studierenden das Wesen der Dinge, ob in der Naturform oder in der technischen Form, zu entdecken. Also die Spitze, Stachlichkeit der Distel als Wesen zu entdecken. Also auch eine Bewegungsrichtung, die da drin steckt. Also eine Charakteristik, die genauso zu entdecken ist in diesem Sägeblatt aus Metall oder in der Biegbarkeit dieses Bleches oder in der Glätte und Schwere dieses dunklen Holzes. Dieses Wesen zu entdecken als Teil einer Struktur, die neu zusammengefügt und gestaltet werden kann. Dahinter steht die Idee, dass es eine letztendlich ewige Einheit des Schönen zwischen dem Kosmischen und dem Menschlichen gibt. Und die Kunst eine Verwirklichung des Menschen sein müsste oder des Zusammenklangs von Mensch und Materie. Das ist ein relativ spirituelles und auch esoterisch gefärbtes Konzept gewesen. Im Vorkurs ging es wesentlich darum, dass die Studierenden das Material des Gestaltens grundsätzlich und elementar kennenlernen. Dazu gehörten natürlich die Materialien verschiedenster Art, aber eben auch die Farbe als Material. Deshalb haben eben Wassily Kandinsky und Paul Klee als Maler im Vorkurs Farbenlehren gegeben. Es ging allerdings nicht um Malerei, sondern um die Farbe als Grundelement des Bauens, des Gestaltens überhaupt. Und so konnte man dann mit diesen Formen anfangen, zunächst Bilder zu bauen. Und die Hoffnung war, dass aus diesen Bildern dann irgendwann auch Räume baubar werden, weil ja die Farben eben auch eine räumliche Wirkung haben. Und darum ging es letztendlich am Bauhaus, räumlich wirksame Phänomene begreifbar zu machen.
Ich bin fest überzeugt, dass wenn Schlemmer heute sein triadisches Ballett bauen würde, dann würde er wahrscheinlich Popping- und Funktänzer benutzen, die geometrische Formen benutzen seit den 70ern. Er würde sich bei ihnen bereichern und somit neue Formen finden, um den Raum zu entdecken. Ich bin fest davon überzeugt. ich anderen Künsten zuhöre und wenn ich sage, ja, das, was ihr macht, das erkenne ich bei mir hier wieder und dadurch kann ich an dieser Stelle weiterdenken. Diese Form des interdisziplinären Denkens, Arbeitens, keine Angst davor zu haben, vor Größen, Namen, einfach nachmachen, besser machen, anders machen, probieren, dieses Experimentieren. Ich glaube, da liegen Möglichkeiten drin, Qualität zu finden.
If you are a computer scientist who practices martial arts, you can go from there to street dancing, and from street dancing to contemporary dance. You can receive as a gift a book of Kandinsky at just the right moment. You can put it all together yourself. There are pearls strewn on every path.
Ich glaube, dass ich auf jeden Fall Nähe finden kann zu den Arbeiten von Kandinsky. Ich habe das Buch, glaube ich, das letzte Mal Punktlinie zur Fläche vor 3 Jahren oder so gelesen. Und es war für mich einfach so Pflichtlektüre. Aber ich habe da drin auch meine Arbeiten von heute wiedererkannt. Alles, was ich mache, ist Mathematik. Alles, was ich mache, ist Ausmessen von Orten, wo etwas hingehört oder eben nicht. Und so zu gestalten, mit Hilfe von Mathematik zu gestalten, ist für mich auch im poetischen Kontext nicht wirklich fremd. Punkt zu einer Linie, dann hoch zu einer Fläche. Das kann man sich dann auch vorstellen. Aber wenn man sich das von einer Maschine berechnen lässt und sagt, die nächste Linie liegt aber wo ganz anders, dann klappt die sich plötzlich rum und zieht sich zusammen, schiebt sich nach da und geht um die Ecke. Und plötzlich hat man so eine Form, wo man sagt, so dieses sequentielle Isolieren von Zip ist doch dann sehr tänzerisch, ja? Was man vielleicht als Choreograf, der sich mit Mathematik beschäftigt, und als Architekt, der sich mit Mathematik beschäftigt, gemeinsam hat, ist, dass man interessiert ist an Stimmigkeiten. Die Stimmigkeiten ergeben sich meistens links und rechts vom Ist-Gleichzeichen. Man versucht da eine Balance zu finden. Aber zur Balance und zur Stimmigkeiten, da gehört dann auch ein goldener Schnitt. Ist das zu viel? Ist das jetzt noch genau richtig? Ist es das, was ich wollte? Und da trifft sich dann auch das Experiment der Architektur, das Experiment mit der Bühne, ja, und das Experiment mit dem Körper.
In the year 2011, designer Rosan Bosch was tasked with designing a school in Stockholm that the children never wanted to leave. The result was a school without a single classroom.
We are a multidisciplinary studio working with art, design and architecture. We create design as a tool. So our goal is not creating lovely design things, but our goal is influencing the society with our work. Society has always been changing, but I think that there are some big challenges, some kind of fundamental changes happening right now. So in a way, we actually don't really know what children have to learn in order to be best prepared for the future of tomorrow. But I know one thing, that if these children have learned the tools how to learn, have learned to know themselves, what their possibilities are, and they feel confident with themselves, and they have experienced the joy of learning, as in learning is just fun, it's great, it's a good thing for me, it makes me feel good, then they're best prepared for this future. This is actually originally an old industrial space. It's very open, but the space is divided with different elements, creating space inside a space. Behind me you can see the Blue Mountain, the core of the school, which is like a theater space. Inside the mountain we have a small red dark cinema, and also a cave space. You can go in here and be alone. and for yourself. On this side of the mountain, we have a different kind of open space with small group spaces, the houses, which are actually spaces for groups to work in dialogue, what we call campfire spots. And and with me here, I'm also carrying one of the specialities of the school. This is a little carpet, and as you can see, you can carry it around. And I think that for some kind of reason, this is the core of what Vittra School is about. It's about giving the children the opportunity to be active instead of passive. It's this change where you can actually be where you need to be according to your learning. Now, we're walking around the mountain, and as you can see, this is actually a way of dividing the space in different areas. And we have platforms in the window, which is like a space to sit when you want to be a bit separate, when maybe you need to concentrate, or you want to be a bit more private.
Hör ni mina vänner, lyssna noggrant. Hallå, lystry, M3. Då gör vi så här att ni ställer tillbaka alla pennor och tar med era ritningar bort till Blåberget.
Bra! Säg det allihopa, 68
500.
Bara 68
598 kronor.
Säg dem bara. Bensin,
Biogas.
biogas,
Olja.
It's kind of a weird concept that our mind is separated from our body and that we learn with our mind, our brain, and not with our body, which is completely absurd. It's obvious that our body is kind of the shell that creates our understanding of the world. And we do interact, we modificate our movements, our way of communicating with each other in accordance to the physical space and the objects in it that are surrounding us. We change our way of walking depending on what kind of landscape we're in, and we change our way of communicating with each other depending on, the context that is surrounding us. So for me, I think that design is about body.
(1921) hat Walter Gropius die Bühnenwerkstatt am Bauhaus eingerichtet. Bei Gropius ging es darum, Architektur als Raumkunst neu zu erfinden. Das Ziel war, die Formfragen, die Fragen von Rhythmus, Struktur, Komposition, Volumen, alles das, was eigentlich eine räumliche Wirkung erzeugen kann, das sollte dort untersucht werden. Allerdings wurden hier nicht Tänzer oder Schauspieler ausgebildet, sondern Architekten und Designer. Es ging darum zu spüren, wie verläuft eine Linie, wie ist eine Raumspannung aufgemacht. Was macht das mit dem Körper? Wie verhält sich der Körper zu dem, was eine Geometrie, eine Form im Raum ist? Wie kann er damit interagieren? Und wie entsteht Raum und Raumform durch die Bewegung? Nur dann kann ich auch das, was ich hier so spielerisch entwickle, auch am Ende reflektieren und irgendwann auch in das ganz normale alltägliche Entwurfsdenken einbauen. Aber es eröffnet vor allen Dingen, das Vorstellungsvermögen, es stimuliert die Einbildungskraft, weil ich kann im Sekundentakt ständig neue Raumkonstellationen, also auch Raum- und Körperkonstellationen produzieren.
The Bauhaus school was a foreign body in Weimar, subject to hostility. It disturbed and shocked. The students flew kites in the middle of the city. They had parties, walked around like punks. And whatever they were learning there seemed complete nonsense and was highly dubious. Bauhaus had to justify its existence, and in 1923, it mounted a large exhibition. Oskar Schlemmer painted murals in the school's stairway for the occasion, with his vision of humanity.
This entire stairway was painted such, with its tonality, the structure of its colors, from the ceiling all the way down, that it would be understood by Schlemmer to be all about the flow and perception of space. That in fact, it was a type of design lesson.
Und eigentlich war das auch eine Art Lehrstück, also wie viele andere Details in das Bauhaus.
As with many other Bauhaus details, this painting by Schlemmer formed a part of his teachings about the way in which the body in space and scale and movement worked. Essentially, this was Schlemmer's thesis, that humans are not spiritually autonomous beings, but rather spatial figures that define the space around them.
Eine Geistesfigur war, sondern eine räumliche Figur. Das definierte den Raum an sich. Und dann letztendlich, als die Nazis...
Then when the Nazis came to power in the Thuringian State Parliament in 1930, they painted over the complete work of art.
Die gesamte Malerei weggestrichen.
It was clear Bauhaus had no future in Weimar. But it wasn't just political pressure that drove Walter Gropius to seek out a new place for the school. He wanted the school to reinvent itself, to move away from the idea of artisan craftspeople and work together with industry. The Haus am Horn building in Weimar was the first concrete example of the movement's new watchword, a unity of art and engineering. Together, artists and engineers would be able to design a better world for everyone. In the end, Bauhaus moved the school in 1925 to the industrial city of Dessau, at the time one of Germany's high-tech centers. While the new school building designed by Walter Gropius was being built, the Bauhaus students were already working on the interior fittings. And so it came to stand, almost floating in the open space, like the embodiment of the idea of harmony between reason and beauty.
Also, das wissen wir, dass das Haus ja auch eine Art Experiment war.
Of course, we know that the building was some kind of experiment. It was an experiment about the state of architecture itself, as well as being an experiment for the students.
Sieht man auch, wie das Gebäude eigentlich wie eine Maschine funktioniert.
One can also see how the building actually functions like a sort of machine. It's all mechanical, full of industrialized elements. The Bauhaus moved far away from its arts and crafts roots, and with this building, it jumped straight into the industrial era.
Hier mit das Haus richtig in die industrielle Zeitalter sozusagen reingesprungen. Das Bauhaus war eine Art architektonisches Gesamtkunstwerk.
Bauhaus was something of a Gesamtkunstwerk, in which everyone participated in its architectural and interior design. Here, in the auditorium, for example, the seating was designed by Marcel Breuer, installed and even tested by him. That was also in itself a form of experiment, to see how the fabric and its materiality functioned.
Experiment, auch wie der Stoff mit dem Material funktioniert. Moholy-Nagy hat den
Moholy-Nagy designed, tested, and implemented the lighting systems. In a certain sense, one can say that the Bauhaus was a form of proof of concept. There was the opportunity here, because they were working with students, to try things out, things that were not necessarily immediately made public.
Sachen zu probieren, die vielleicht auch nicht immer ganz gleich öffentlich waren. Es gab in das Bauhaus viele diverse Werkstätten, also die Tischlerei.
There were a number of trade workshops at the Bauhaus, a carpentry workshop, printing workshop, a weaving workshop. This is where the students were able to put into practice the theory of their studies. This gave birth to the alternative pedagogical catchphrase, learning by doing. Next to the artistic directors, there was also a master craftsperson guiding the students with technical skills, so that at the end of their studies, they also received an official apprenticeship certificate. The Bauhaus masters, including Gropius himself, coerced most of the female students into the weaving workshop. Marianne Brandt was the only one who made it into Moholy-Nagy's metal workshop.
Und dort hat sie großartige Sachen gemacht. In diesem Zimmer von Marianne Brandt kann man so ein bisschen den Geist von den
Here, in Marianne Brandt's room, one can get a hint of this feeling of community spirit. And in this residence section of the Bauhaus, the atelier, is where both students and teachers came together. These were people from countries all over the place, speaking all sorts of languages, so there was a huge cacophony of sounds. These walls were super porous, without any soundproofing, so one could hear everything going on throughout the whole building.
Also sehr, sehr hellhörig, man hörte halt alles. Auch die Balkone waren ein extrem wichtiges Element des Zimmers. Die waren Teil von dieser.
The balconies were also an extremely important element of the rooms. They were part of the communication structure, in a sense, part of the basic concept of the Bauhaus, whereby people could speak with and wave to each other, and if they hadn't already introduced each other through the walls, they could do so outside on the facade. In principle, just as the Bauhaus itself sought to link all these various layers of meaning with each other, the balconies were a connecting element between outside and inside, as well as creating a vertical communication structure that is seen throughout the building.
Aber auch in sich eine vertikale Struktur von Kommunikation, die dann auch durch das Haus durchgezogen hat.
Bevor man baut, bevor man gestaltet, ging es Gropius darum, dass die Schule selber als eine Lebensgemeinschaft, als eine Lern- und Arbeitsgemeinschaft ja, dieses neue Leben auch gewissermaßen verkörpert. Und die Feste waren da sowas wie ein Bühnenstück, was man zunächst für sich aufgeführt hat und nach immer mehr Gäste dazu eingeladen hat. Da gab es ein Thema, metallisches Fest, Schmierfinkenfest, Schlagwörterfest oder das Weiße Fest, das war hier das erste Fest in Dessau. Dieses Motto hat gereicht, um alle zu motivieren, sich entsprechende Kostüme zu basteln, wie wir jetzt hier für das blaue Fest meinetwegen blaue Masken machen heute. Das ist das Grundmodul, schon ein einzelnes kleines Haus. Erweiterbar, wenn eine Familie wohlhabender wird aufgestockt und seitlich erweiterbar und wenn es einem ganz gut geht, macht man noch eine Dachterrasse. Im Grunde das Prinzip eines wachsenden Hauses, aufgebaut aus vorgeplanten, vorgefertigten Modulen idealerweise, die dann aber auch verschieden komponiert werden können. Das ist der Baukasten im Großen. Von Walter Gropius, 1923 entworfen. Und hier ahnt man schon, wie dieser Baukasten das Prinzip der Dessauer Meisterhäuser vorweggenommen hat. Im Grunde haben wir hier eine Doppelhaushälfte eines Meisterhauses. Das kann man sich dann hier fortgesetzt vorstellen. Sobald ich einen Baukasten habe, gibt mir dieser Baukasten bestimmte Bedingungen vor, Parameter des Entwerfens, und komme zu Raumbildern, Ideen, die ich ohne diesen Baukasten so nicht hätte haben können. Also sehr eigensinnige, eigenartige Komposition. Ja, das Baukastendenken ist grundlegend für die Entwicklung der modernen Architektur. Ja, weil dahinter die Idee steckt, aus vorgefertigten Einzelteilen letztendlich eine serielle und eine Massenproduktion ermöglichen zu können. Letztendlich steckt auch dahinter die Idee, dass die strenge Logik der Maschine, der Apparate, ja das menschliche Leben auch im geistigen Sinne bereichernde Dimensionen bereithält. Also nicht nur von der Natur, vom organischen Wachstum, sondern von der Mathematik, der Geometrie, vom technischen Denken her zu Erfindungen kommen.
Das, was hier früher stand, das Gropius Meisterhaus, also das Direktorenhaus.
That which stood here earlier, the Gropius Master's House, essentially the director's house, was lost during the war. Afterwards, there was simply a little East German house here on the site that was occupied in a completely normal way. Bombs also destroyed half of the adjacent Master's House. And when I came here, these were all just being used as regular residential houses.
Wohnhäuser. A
few years ago, this abstracted element was added to give a sense of how the ensemble as a whole functioned.
Wie diese gesamte Ensemble mal war.
The master's houses were considered a model of modern residential building. Gropius's wife Isa and her friends even appeared in a kind of training film to demonstrate the culture of modern living. Most people, however, had no access to lovely homes and cleverly constructed buildings. Quite the opposite. So Walter Gropius built one of the first estates of row houses in Dessau's Torten sector, erected according to industrial principles, on the assembly line, as it were. Each apartment was built in less than 2 days. The foreman was engineer Ernst Neufert, who had also overseen construction of the Bauhaus school buildings in Dessau.
Without standards, the systems of modularity, which create the basis of our contemporary industrial era, would not be possible.
Die Bauentwurfslehre von Ernst Neufert.
Ernst Neufert's architect's data. It's actually unbelievable what all he incorporated into his norms. Every element of construction, the way in which people move within buildings, in rooms and spaces was measured. This was done with what one could call such a sense of precision that both an absolute minimum amount of space as well as the ideal amount of space required can be surmised.
Die man braucht, als auch die ideale Platzbedarf. Man sieht, wie weit nach hinten.
One can even see here how far back a chair can be placed in order that the waiter can get by in the given space.
Also hier sieht zum Beispiel sogar der sogenannte Abortpapier, das hat so 17
Here, for
Zentimeter
example,
mal
one can see
26
that the toilet paper roll should be 17 centimeters by 26 centimeters and sit 70 centimeters above ground. The human figure was meant to have a certain size, and when was too big, they wouldn't fit. And even if they were too small, it wouldn't work. Here, we have the desired optimum of space such that one can comfortably get a towel around the body to nicely dry the back.
Den Handtuch auf den Rücken schön zum Trocknen bringt. Ja, natürlich den Raum zwischen Wanne
And of course,
und
the
Wand
space between the bathtub and the wall is very important when one bends over to clean the tub.
Das ist so ein Katalog fast von der Geschichte der
Basically, it's a
deutsche-
catalog of the history of the German culture of standards and norms.
Wie baue ich den Raum
Effectively, Neufert's mantra was how to build a space efficiently with the most ideal and minimal use of materials.
wäre sozusagen Neuferts Ansatz.
Es sollte ja keine Siedlung sein für Millionäre. Es nannte sich halbländliche Siedlung. Wir sollten Hühner und Kaninchen haben, hatten wir auch. Also eine Ziege vielleicht noch, aber Schweine und sowas nicht. Ich stehe auf Gropius. Ich lasse nichts auf die Bauart von damals kommen. Das war eine große Sache, eine ganz große Sache. Anders als die anderen, die bauten alles gleiche Strichen. Wir haben es natürlich später tapeziert. Die Frauen, die wollten doch lieber eine Tapete. So modern waren wir eben noch nicht, aber es war wunderschön. Die Decken anders als die Wände. Ich lasse nicht so Gropius kommen.
As a young girl, Miss Anton moved with her parents from a cramped, dark, working-class apartment into this small house with a garden. A huge step forward.
Sie müssen mal bedenken, für 9.000 Mark haben wir das gekauft. Nicht 1.000 Mark anzahlen müssen, die hatten wir kaum. Da war nämlich gerade die Inflation gewesen. So praktisch und bequem, wie es Gropius gebaut hat, für damalige Zeiten. Jetzt würde es wahrscheinlich auch etwas anders machen, nicht? Ich meine, größere irgendwie, also alle jetzt ein großes Wohnzimmer wollen. Aber für uns war es schön.
Naja, die Fenster waren damals etwa 60 cm mal 2,40 und diese Fenster habe ich alle rausgerissen und mit neu ersetzt. Anschließend habe ich, was früher der Balkon war, diesen habe ich auch, das Eisengitter ringsherum, auch alles entfernt. Ja, das Wohnzimmer, das habe ich auch mit dran gebaut, 6,5 Meter mal 3,60 Meter und anschließend ein Schuppen von 7,5 Meter mal 3,60 Meter.
Wir sind hier in der 100-Euro-Wohnung. Das ist die kleinste Wohnung Deutschlands. Die hat nur 6,4 Quadratmeter. Es ist ein Raum mit Küche, Bad, Büro. Und wir sind hier praktisch gerade im Wohnzimmer. Es gibt hier sogar ein Gästebett. Das Ding kann man zum Beispiel für Überraschungsgäste umfunktionieren zu einem Gästebett. So. Die Wohnung ist 2 Meter breit nur. Ich glaube, es gibt keine Wohnung, die so schmal ist wie diese hier. Und was halt ganz schön ist, ist, wir haben hier so wahnsinnig hohe Deckenhöhen. Das sind 3,60 Meter. Das kennt man eigentlich nur so aus dem Altbau eigentlich. Ne? Das wird im Neubau eigentlich nicht mehr gemacht. Nicht effizient. Und wir haben diese 100-Euro-Wohnung entwickelt. Hier steht es zwar auf einem Anhänger als Tiny House, aber wir haben es schon als Neubaukonzept entwickelt. Das ist praktisch ein Showroom, um zu zeigen, dass es theoretisch möglich wäre, mitten in der Stadt, wo die Mieten teuer sind, Wohnungen anzubieten, die nur 100 Euro Miete kosten. Und wir haben das über die Größe gelöst. Ne? Wir sind einfach so klein geworden, dass es nach den gängigen Immobilienmarktpreisen nur 100 Euro Miete kosten würde. Das sind ja nur 6,4 Quadratmeter. Und hier passt aber trotzdem eine Küche noch rein. Hier ist ein Schreibtisch. Hier haben auch schon 4 bis 6 Leute gegessen. Und hier gibt es ein Bad noch hinter dieser Wand. Das ist eine Spiegelwand. Und dahinter befindet sich ein Bad mit Dusche und mit WC und einem kleinen Waschbecken. Und hier oben gibt es ein Loft. Da kann man entweder schlafen oder auch arbeiten. Das ist mein Traum, dass wir Gemeinschaft, Nachbarschaft neu denken, humaner machen, demokratischer machen, ohne dass es so abhängig ist immer von deinem Einkommen. Ich finde, existieren auf der Welt muss bedingungslos sein. Ohne Geld muss ich das Recht haben, in der Stadt, da wo alle sind, zu existieren. Und da das natürlich nicht geht, weil es viele Menschen sind, okay, vielleicht gibt es dann einfach kleine Wohnungen, oder? Die so klein sind, dass man kaum Kosten verursacht. 47, 47, 47.
How do you build a city for everyone? Urban Think Tank, a collective of architects and urban planners, works with its students in Zurich, developing concepts for the city of the 21st century.
We have to train a new generation of architects to engage, to align interests, to understand actually what the challenges are and prepare them for a profession which is not anymore building one sustainable house with photovoltaic panels on the roof in the countryside of Switzerland, freestanding, eating up land, but building a dense, socially challenged environment in the places where it matters.
In Latin America, as much as 95% of the population lives in the cities. They are no longer able to eke out an existence in the countryside. They escape to the cities and look for a free spot to build themselves a hut. Urban Think Tank has been working in the slums of the Southern Hemisphere for 20 years.
A traditional city is built by requiring a land title, making a plan, building a house, and moving into that house. And if you look at slum areas, it's the exact opposite. You move on a site with nothing, you build, perhaps at some moment you will get a land title. And it's in this inversiveness of things, in this collateral thinking, in this lack of regulations and norms, that those are actually places of innovation, not only of misery.
Esta casa la construyó mi mamá. Entonces ella le iba haciendo de a pedacito, de a murito, de a pieza, hasta que ya la hizo toda completa. No existían casas. Llegamos pues como una invasión, una casita de plástico, de palos. Por 3 veces la tumbó la policía y volvió, y mi mamá pues por la necesidad volvió y la armó. Y ya empezó ella a construir ya lo último, ya no la volvieron a tumbar.
Right in front of you, you have gas tanks. Over there, you have the main bus terminal. The train station is just a little further, the subway stop, the bus terminal. They come, they cross the bridge. And the first barrio that they hit as refugees coming from the countryside is the barrio of Moravia and Oasis on the upper level. So we're right at the heart of the beginning of what we call temporary housing, informal housing, or we can call it first step housing. It's the first step you take when you decide to come to the city.
It is this barrio slum-like development that people can afford and where they can find roots and develop that into perhaps even consolidated neighborhoods. So even if people manage to bring their first stronghold, put their foot in the urban territory, they need assistance. So we need to incorporate today in these settlements, we have to bring like acupuncture points, infrastructures in, we have to bring
new buildings in that are beyond the reach of the people. They cannot build a bigger hall, a roofed city hall. They cannot build a schoolhouse. They are not going to build public spaces. They need assistance. They cannot be left alone.
Hey, mira.
Esa es su cancha de fútbol. Esa es su cancha. ¿Quién es el mejor colombiano en el fútbol? Tú.
Mira.
Mira, aquí está el profesor. El profesor.
Apart from lots carved out for sporting activities, there's very little open space in slumlands. Urban Think Tank builds upwards on those plots so they can be used for a variety of purposes. The concept is called a vertical gym.
A vertical gym is obviously a lot more than a sports structure, and you can do basically everything there, from art, music school to a community center, whatever you want to do on a sports field. It is again a piece of infrastructure, a commitment, a visible transformation of a neighborhood which is run by the neighborhood.
The vertical gym in Caracas attracts 15,000 visitors per month, and neighborhood crime has dropped by 30%.
We also figured out again that actually the martial arts area was also used as a kindergarten and so forth. So people are very inventive once you give them a space that can be programmed freely. It is probably the biggest pickup place for young people. And we built another one in Baruta, we built another one in Petare, in El Dorado, and it has become a system that is replicable. And right now we're actually looking at Medellín, where the mayor of Medellín invited us, where we need actually to attend an increasing number of young population, where such a vertical gym makes a real difference in the day-to-day life of those people.
Mira, en el futuro usted está diciendo que todas esas casas aquí están prácticamente por reemplazarles para poner nuevos desarrollos.
Well, I measured that it's from that tree to that wall, you have about 35 meters.
And we need 25, so...
Right, so we need 25, so we got space there.
It is sort of...
Well, and then you can have the running track going around, which can connect with a bridge into the school.
Estoy improvisando desde la comuna 10, donde me estoy encontrando. Esto se hace y es muy sencillo. Los carros pasan y aún así brillo. Yo voy rapeando y aunque de marca no es mi suela. Un saludo para toda la gente de Venezuela. Esto se hace así desde Colombia. Y para solamente Dios en la gloria, y por eso lo hago con mucha actitud. Cambiaremos el país, solo la juventud, yeah.
It's about 100,000 people living in this bowl, this neighborhood, in a slum, what you would call a slum, and people call their homes. And as you look around, you'll see it's very deficient of public infrastructure. And we have an open piece of land where houses once stood. And the idea is to make a strong social center.
Sigo cantando y saben lo hago despacio, pero con el rap vamos recuperando espacios. Por eso es...
So how can we actually add to what is already here, consolidate better what is needed, and create a starting point, a crystallization point that people see that the city government cares, and that they can develop the neighborhood out of their own efforts, but they have also assistant top-down meets bottom-up.
The lower strata of society in 1920s Europe were also often former agricultural laborers and impoverished farmers who now lived in slums and shacks on the margins of urban areas. They arrived ready to work in cities that were not ready for them. Modern architects responded with residential estates designed to highlight above all light, air, and hygiene. In the row houses in Turton, Walter Gropius actually built a goat shed next to the kitchen. But now it was time for large apartment buildings. Gropius finally set up an architecture department at the Bauhaus school in 1927. To lead it, he lured the left-wing Swiss architect Hannes Meyer to Dessau. A year later, Gropius left Bauhaus and appointed Meyer his successor.
Für Meyer war Kunst in die Architektur überhaupt
For
nicht
Meyer,
interessant.
art and architecture was of no interest whatsoever. It wasn't important. For him, building was a scientific process. Function and economics were to find a way to work together. It didn't have to be chic or elegant, simply functional and affordable by anyone. His motto was, people's needs, rather than the need for luxury. For example, one of the exercises for his students was to build a stable, functional, and economical chair out of 1 square meter of plywood, so that every person had access to good quality furniture, so that everyone could have a stool just like this one.
Jeder so eine Hocke haben kann.
My heroes, they are all located in the Bauhaus era. They set Volksbedarf statt Luxusbedarf. And I would like to bring the idea of Bauhaus back to that track. I started with the 24 euro chair, which can be built with just 24 euros and within 24 hours. And the idea is to enable people with low income to create their own Bauhaus furniture. And I've created blueprints and published them in the internet, with which you can rebuild your own Bauhaus luxury furniture with very low money. Wow, it's a participation project, like Bauhaus was.
Hannes Meyer remained director for less than 3 years. In 1930, he was dismissed from the Bauhaus school for communist activities. The new director was not only very famous, but also politically neutral, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. His building set the style for international architecture. But his international reputation was of no use to Mies in Dessau. The Bauhaus there was closed by the local council in 1932 at the request of the Nazi Party. And the only building Mies built in Dessau was a refreshment stand. Mies moved the Bauhaus school to Berlin, then closed it voluntarily in 1933 under pressure from the Nazis. Oskar Schlemmer spent the last years of his life working in a paint factory in Wuppertal. The Bauhaus building in Dessau became a home economics college. Bauhaus was hit by a hammer, and the shards burst out into the world. In 1933, Bauhaus teacher Joseph Albers and his wife, the weaver Annie Albers, emigrated to America. In North Carolina, Black Mountain College had just opened as the incarnation of a universal Bauhaus spirit. It was a liberal arts school that also taught natural sciences, a place where books were written and campus life was organized as a collective, an outpost of utopia in the arid America of the Great Depression. Joseph and Annie Albers alighted there, where they taught for 16 years. Other Bauhaus adherents would follow them. Two elderly ladies in New York today. And perhaps that's what it will be like when the children from the Stockholm school, with the Blue Mountain at its center, look back at their lives. In 1950, as a young woman, Canadian painter Dorothea Rockburn moved to the States and studied art and mathematics at Black Mountain.
I was 13 when I decided to be an artist, serious artist. It's not that I made a decision, it's that that seemed to be what was happening. It's the only thing I really wanted to do. Which at that point in the history of women, not so easy. You know. These are the Eisenhower years, and America was particularly repressed. Just right after the Second World War, and ticky-tacky houses, and 2.5 children, and that was what was being preached. And that wasn't Black Mountain. And when I went to Black Mountain, I took math and art and music, and that's what you did at Black Mountain, and it was a real community, and everybody was very smart. Each day was exciting and interesting. And I knew that I would have a foundation for my life by going there, which I did. I don't think I was I'm still not goal-oriented. I don't really like goals. They seem like the end of something. I'm much more interested in process. And I was interested in the process of learning. And I just learn. That I was 18 and I'd been living at home until I went first to Paris and then to Black Mountains. I mostly was very interested in going there because of Albert and studying art, because that was my whole focus when I was just 18. And since we had several Bauhaus people at the school, one had to always be concerned about the aesthetics of everything in life. And I liked that very much. If you were studying science, it's very disciplined. The same in the art, you had to find your way. Within that, you were a community, and we all had to participate in community life and help to make the school work. We worked on the farm, we worked in the kitchen. Bob Rauschenberg and I were on the garbage crew, and we had so much fun doing the trash that everybody wanted to go with us because we'd always come back laughing and bringing more things back than we picked up and took. It's a collage of these women who were called the Ziegfeld girls. Here in this collage, we were trying to keep the circles consistent, so everything else kind of adjusts to the circles. They look almost like they could be fine, but they are a little strange. A little bit dressed, a little bit undressed, arms not quite touching the other part of the arms, but they kind of seem jolly. Other schools turned you out to be something. You went in one end and you came out the other as an engineer or a writer or whatever. And Black Mountain was all about cross-pollination. They were interested in your having an education and learning philosophy, history, mathematics, painting, dance, music. And the way you earned a living when you got out was something you had to deal with. And I think that's what education should be. Due to the education I received, I was able to teach myself mathematics, and that's not easy. I mean, first of all, I learned good study habits. And, just the joy of learning, as I say, it's not ever been goal-oriented.
is I think that having goal-orient is a short-sighted vision.
Black Mountain had become one of the most important schools in the post-war art landscape, a wellspring for John Cage, Robert Rauschenberg, Merce Cunningham, installations and happenings. Modern architecture from Europe lived on in the international style of New World cities, cities built from scratch on open spaces that pragmatically changed their gestalt when it was time. But back home, the old European city was still cramped, overcrowded, and blighted. There were perhaps a few modern residential tracts on the outskirts, but the city centers were made up of slums, alleyways, and backyards.
Il y avait une surmortalité tuberculeuse gigantesque. Il y avait des problèmes de salubrité incroyables. Il y avait une pollution bien plus grande encore que celle qu'on peut imaginer aujourd'hui. Cette ville semblait totalement étouffée et donc il fallait l'aérer, la rendre plus vivante. La réflexion sur la ville a suivi en fait la réflexion formelle que les architectes modernes avaient sur la forme de l'habitation. Ils se sont dit, après avoir essayé de réformer le bâtiment, il fallait penser la ville plus globale. Le plus célèbre d'entre eux est donc le congrès qui est parti de Marseille en bateau et qui est arrivé à Athènes, dans laquelle Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe et l'ensemble des acteurs modernes ont réfléchi à une charte qui pourrait être un espèce de guide pour les urbanistes.
A boat journey, a fresh wind and a vista to the horizon. Clever folk, perhaps cheerful, perhaps empathetic. And Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, avant-garde media artist and former Bauhaus teacher, captures the crossing on film. But what emerged from the journey, the Athens Charter, was a ruthless document on urban living, which foresaw entire old towns falling in its path. The vision of a society flooded with light and air was now being transformed into a project for a technocratic necropolis. The new ideal city was to be above all functional and tidy. The city's center was to be reserved for commerce, administration, and leisure activities. Nobody would live there anymore. On one side, there would be open residential estates with recreational spaces. On the other, work, the filth, and the stench. New satellite towns, bedroom communities, would be built far away from everything in green belts. Broad streets would offset the resulting traffic flows. And after the destruction of World War II, those concepts would actually be implemented. What began here had its sad culmination in the car-friendly cities of the 1960s. Those plans relegated the idea of the holistic human and their needs to history. Walter Gropius, who by then lived in Cambridge, was commissioned in the 1960s to plan a residential estate south of Berlin. He wanted the tallest of the buildings to have a maximum of 5 stories. In the end, the highest house in the Gropiusstadt would reach 30 stories.
Es gibt eben Gesetzmäßigkeiten der räumlichen Wahrnehmung. Da kommt es auf Entfernung an oder Höhe von Gebäuden oder Naturdenkmalen, was auch immer. Und das sagt man eben, dass so bis zu 4-geschossigen Wohnbauten man diesen menschlichen Maßstab noch hat oder zumindest noch empfinden kann. Dass Mutter und Kind eben noch miteinander sprechen oder sich was zurufen können. Und auf die horizontale Entfernung ist ein wichtiger Maßstab, dass man ein menschliches Gesicht noch erkennen kann. Also dass man auf die Entfernung sieht, aha, das ist ein Nachbar, den kenne ich. Oder eben es ist ein Fremder. Und das ist so ein erstes Unterscheidungsmerkmal. in sozialer Hinsicht. Und danach richtet sich idealerweise eben auch die Länge von solchen Wohnbauten.
Le Corbusier also built his Cité radieuse on the outskirts of Marseille on open land. It was intended to be an ideal residential complex in a city that would be divided according to function. Beautiful, intelligently laid out apartments, far ahead of their time, a building with its own infrastructure, and lots of public space for everything people didn't want to do at home. The roof to serve as a town square, schoolyard and cultural center, shops and a bar on the third floor. Every apartment like a small house on a village main street.
On arrive dans ce couloir très sombre, on arrive dans ce lieu plein de lumière. On passe par un petit sas qui est une espèce de métaphore de l'entrée dans laquelle on peut juste enlever ses chaussures. Ensuite, on arrive dans une cuisine qui fait 4 mètres carrés 75.
The storage fountains, which is a very clever way to hide the extraction of the fumes, which is behind here. And everything is actually sliding, so you don't lose space with the doors coming up to your face. You also have a way to evacuate the rubbish directly through the sink with the water of the washing. It goes to the sewage system. And you might have noticed that there's also an ice box fitting the kitchen, which can be used also from the outside for the delivering of the ice blocks. In 1950s, till quite late, in the 60s, you could actually place phone orders to the stores on the third level, and they would deliver your groceries or your milk or your dry clean into this box. And from the inside of the flat, you have a little door where you can get it back. So the specificity of this kitchen is that it's completely open onto the dining space. The key point was that the housewife was not locked in the kitchen preparing the meal for the family, but she was able to discuss, interact, and also to get some help from the kids. Like on that side, she would prepare the meal, she could pass the plate here, and on the other end, the kid could help her by setting up the table, by taking the glass and the plates from the cupboard on that side.
Le Corbusier avait réfléchi pendant la guerre avec son équipe et un petit peu avant à faire le bâtiment du futur. C'était vraiment sa volonté de faire le bâtiment le plus moderne dans lequel il ferait la synthèse de toutes les réflexions qu'il avait menées dans l'entre-deux-guerres sur la question de l'habitation. Il a voulu rattacher l'unité de mesure à celle de l'homme et donc il a créé cet étalon d'1,83 m à partir duquel toute la construction de ce bâtiment a été faite. Pour redessiner le monde à sa mesure, il a voulu inventer un nouveau module pour faire l'architecture qui soit adapté au corps humain. Hans Neufert, lui, a essayé de rationaliser le monde sans vouloir le révolutionner. Donc c'est une façon très différente. Il y a d'un côté une vision qui est celle de vouloir transformer le monde et d'une autre de rationaliser l'habitation.
The building was planned as low-cost housing and became a visionary construction project. But it was in fact prohibitively expensive. It cost 40 times as much as a traditional residential high-rise. And it stood alone, under a different star than all the other satellite towns and bedroom communities that were carving out their spots.
On a eu notamment autour de ce qu'on a appelé la ceinture de Paris, une question très importante au XXe siècle qui était le relogement de populations qui habitaient dans des bidonvilles. La Grande Borne est une d'entre ces grands ensembles qui avait l'espoir de casser un petit peu, par la dimension artistique, le système des grands ensembles qui était très fonctionnaliste.
It's an almost fanciful place, labyrinthine, bold, but annoyingly empty. The neighborhood appears to be sleeping. There's nothing to do here.
Il n'y a plus de postes, il n'y a plus de médecins dans le domaine de la santé. Il y a 2 médecins actuellement pour 11 000 habitants. Et on est la seule pharmacie aussi. Mais du coup, tout ce déficit en commerce et en professionnels de santé font que c'est un quartier maintenant qui est désert.
Le chantier a démarré en 1967 à partir d'un espace totalement agricole. Cet espace, disons, fermé par les voies structurantes, a posé d'importants problèmes d'abord pour la commune.
La première génération à qui on avait offert un mode de vie confortable a ensuite vu très rapidement les limites de ce confort en termes d'isolation de leur cité par rapport au reste de la ville. Et puis il y a eu aussi des arrivées de populations massives d'autres continents qui n'ont pas forcément été digérées aussi facilement qu'ils avaient été espérés, ont suscité très certainement des problèmes d'intégration et de cohabitation de populations.
On a sur cet espace, et également sur l'espace de Grigny 2, 85 nationalités d'origine. C'est exceptionnel.
Vouloir segmenter à l'échelle d'un territoire comme la région parisienne, ses fonctions d'habitation, de travail, sans gérer intelligemment les problèmes de circulation, sans mettre forcément tous les moyens qu'il fallait pour que la vie puisse être agréable dans ces lieux, a été des ferments de l'échec de ce type d'urbanisme, malgré tous les efforts que les architectes ont pu faire avec leur intelligence, leur savoir-faire, leur talent, pour essayer de rendre ces espaces les plus agréables et les plus vivants possibles.
And so we're interested in looking at new models of development. We are looking at a kind of cross-section between high technology combined with incredible local knowledge.
The barrio of San Javier in Medellín is on a steep slope. In 2011, 6 escalators were built on the hill to make the neighborhood more accessible for its residents. The moving stairs cover a height equivalent to 28 stories. During the Civil War and the drug wars, the neighborhood was considered the most dangerous in the city, with military campaigns claiming several thousand lives. The escalators provide an infrastructure for everyday activities, participation, and gestures of reconciliation. You expect to see escalators in train stations and department stores, not slums. And cable cars belong in the Alps. But Urban Think Tank worked with an Austrian company to develop new infrastructure for a barrio with 45,000 residents, which previously had no access to the public metro system.
Clearly, this sort of apartheid system that poor people and rich people are separated by infrastructure, and we found it a perfect opportunity to bring the population from the top of the mountain into the metro system and connect them with the rest of the town.
A similar project was built at the same time in Medellín. It represents the use of modern technology in a way never envisioned. It opens up new perspectives.
The 3 stations on the top included a music school, a sports facility, and one place just to enjoy the city from one of the most greatest spots in town, perhaps the first time in history that people from that formal wealthy part would go into the barrio on the top of the mountain and see their own city from the same perspective. 40,000 people looked at it. It was almost like you go up to the moon and you look back on Earth. This change of viewpoints, I think, is as important as the pragmatic access question that has been provided by the system.
Before there was no cable car, people walked down 2 hours. Now they can go down in 10 minutes. So you can imagine old people couldn't get to hospitals. Women who were pregnant couldn't get down to have their babies. And a lot of babies were born dead up here. So that whole change by just introducing infrastructure. In the future, the problem will be about urban design. We already know how to make housing. If you look around here, all the houses have been made self-built. So the real problem is not the housing. And maybe Bauhaus, in that sense, was not looking so much at the turn of the century at that problem of urban design. They were looking at individual pieces of architecture. They were looking at the unit of the house and innovating in the actual house. But now in the 21st century, urban design and planning is absolutely the key.
Today, in urban design, people look actually for pedestrian areas. These cities are pedestrian. We're looking for dense areas. Barrios are naturally and usually very dense. They produce relatively little solid trash. They're masters in recycling, if you want so. And we believe actually that we can learn a lot from barrios if we understand better how they function and incorporate it in a new paradigm for urbanization.
In some places, we realize how much we know, and that we actually know what it is we need. The history and the story of Bauhaus is about participation and empathy, about the courage to counter what exists with a new idea. So it can also be about escalators and cable cars, about building blocks and school children, so that history continues.
The most concrete thing that we can bring from the south to the north is a long history of dealing with self-regulation. Because we have no governance system in place, or a very inefficient one, people have had to deal with problems of water infrastructure themselves, as you know, through the barrios and the slums. So it gives us great hope that a self-regulating society maybe could work. Decentralized self-regulating. And we find ways in which the city can be built, but partially built, incrementally built, over time, which is the way we used to build cities. So what's the idea? Europe centers, city centers of about 1 kilometer radius is going to be densified. There's no question that these urban centers will be densified. So we've got to go vertical with those cities. If you add 2 more floors to the buildings, what do? We need maybe elevators, maybe we need connectivity. Okay, so we don't need an elevator for every building or every house. So let's make public elevators on the outside. Let's make them part of the subway system, part of the train network, part of the infrastructure of ABB. Now these public elevators connect with bridges to the new top of the cities, right? You can go up, connect, and then we make sky lobbies where the new movie's playing of Lars von Trier, where we have the new sky party in the roof deck, right? We add all of that new infrastructure to the existing city. We don't build a new city. We don't increase the footprints of cities. We have a whole scenario for creating a fun city.